Okay, so I've got my sketch and I've got the composition I want to go with. Now the next step is translating this onto my larger piece of paper. And my piece of paper is really large, so I'm gonna kind of keep it within this viewing distance for you. But again, you want to think about like creating space on the edge, but filling up your piece of paper. I am going to use my pencil now because I want to be able to erase and get things where I want them to be without a ton of like the really random sketching that I've been doing. And I want to sketch in enough that I can paint the lines over it with the ink and the brush. And so I want to know exactly what the details are. I want to get the lines right so that the inking goes really quick and easy. But I also want to be careful that I'm not like doing tons of smudges because I want to leave it's just a black and white piece, so I want to leave the paper pretty clean. Also, I want to give space. I don't want my lines to be too tight together because the line width of how I ink is going to really matter for like the sense of motion and movement and rhythm that we're going to imbue in this piece. And that's all going to come through the inking. Another thing to keep in mind is that we're not going to be inking in any shapes. It's all going to be lines. So as I kind of plan this out, so even with my house, like I'm not going to be coloring this in. I'm just going to be doing the lines. So I want the lines to be kind of understandable. So I'm going to start with this big walk line. And that's where I'm going to start. Okay, so I'm going to sketch this out. I'm going to stop talking, speed up the video, so you can kind of see the sketch, and then we'll move on to inking after that. But I want to get my sketch, I want to take the time to get my sketch good, because that's going to make the inking so much faster. Here goes. Okay, I think I'm happy with how the sketch has turned out. A couple of notes. You'll notice that the dogs and the car and the scooter I redrew multiple times. So ideally what I should have done is on a sketch piece of paper, I should have practiced exactly how I wanted to draw them before I drew them on my final paper, because what I have now is a bunch of erase marks, and I'll be able to get rid of most of those, but not all of those. They'll be there a little bit. However, each time I drew them, I liked them better and better and better. Also, even though I've drawn dogs a lot, I realized that I really wasn't happy with how these dogs were turning out. So I finally had to like go into my computer and research, like first off, figure out what kind of dogs these were. They're Pekingese dogs. So they've got that like squishy face and all that shaggy fur. And I had to actually like look at a picture before I was able to draw them in a way that I was actually happy with. So sometimes if you go on your walk, you can take pictures, or if you've drawn really good sketches, but you may need to be like, hey, I know this is a hydrangea. What does a hydrangea actually look like? Or I'm trying to draw a chain link fence. What does that actually look like? So feel free to use your computer as a resource. Also, or the internet, your phone, whatever you use. Also, another thing that I've done is I've kind of made everything slightly wonky to create it create sort of this illustrative style, right? So initially I had the fence posts drawn straight up and down, and then I kind of like altered them a little bit because it just gives it a little more character. I've done that with the house, I've done that with the car, I've done that with the scooter a little bit. You can kind of see this like main handle part is like a little bit more curved. The parking sign is tilted a little bit. So all of that contributes to just, it gives it a little bit more personality, more style, but also because these are all curved and tilted, it adds a little bit more action and a little bit more dynamism, make the composition feel a little more exciting and not just like boring, stuck there. So the next thing I need to do is get out my ink and ink this. Okay, I'm ready to ink this thing. To ink, I need my India ink, and you just pour the stopper up and put a couple drops on your palette. Do be warned, India ink is very permanent. So you can see I sort of have this area of my palette that is just dedicated to India ink. It's no longer really good for watercolor because it's permanently stained to that. I'm also wearing my art apron because if I splatter it on my clothes, that is, I now have ink splatters on my clothes. That's just a part of India ink. So if you don't want to stain your palette permanently, you either need to wash it off right away. So you can see like here it kind of stains, but it's still usable. Or use something that's more disposable, like a yogurt container, or I guess this is cottage cheese. That would be great. You need some brushes. It will stain your brushes, but it won't permanently affect your brushes as long as you clean them out really well when you're done. I've got sort of a medium brush that I'm going to use for my walking line because I want it to be thickest, and then I've got sort of a medium small and then a really thin brush that I'm going to use because this is about line quality. I want to have a lot of control over my line quality, and that's easier to do with smaller brushes. I've got water for my brushes, I've got paper towel. I've also got a piece of paper to test out. If you've never worked with India ink before, and to be honest, really, it'd probably be good to like put this away and just really play like we've done with watercolors, and we'll play with India ink in class a little bit too, but just take some time to play. So I'm gonna get my brush wet, make sure it's kind of clean, and then get the excess water out. You don't need to add water to India ink. You can, it just makes it gray, and really for this we want like a strong black line. So we're not gonna add any. But I really recommend just like playing around. If you get too much, it'll go globby. And then you need to think about like just play around with creating lines. So everything on here is gonna be line based, but you also need to imply motion with how your lines are. So you need to imply how fast, how slow, like if you did things, if you kind of rocked back and forth, what you were doing. So plan that out. So Joshua, when he gets going, he kind of goes back and forth a little bit and then goes fast. And I actually really like this kind of dry brush look. I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but it kind of feels a little bit fast. So I'm gonna try to like offload a little bit of ink. And then I'm just gonna do a really boring line. Oops, this is my first line coming out from here. And again, this is permanent, so once you ink, you ink. And then I'm gonna kind of go back and forth and then do those like, whoosh. Oh, and I've got too much ink. I really wanna get that dry brush. So I'm trying to do that. So that feels kind of fast, although I've gotten a little bit too close to my scooter, but you know what? It is what it is at this point. And then we're gonna kind of slow down around the corner and then stop right here. Just gonna do a little stop. And again, I'm kind of getting into my sketches here, but this line, I'm doing my walking line first because that's the most important. So I can adjust some of these things after I do my walking line. And then we're good to go. So we kind of slowly start, and then he zooms around the corner. And he takes that corner really fast, so I'm going to add some zoomy lines. And then we come here, and he stops. So I'm going to do that kind of dot wherever he stops. Oh, he stops right here to say hello to the no parking sign. Okay, a dot wherever he stops, and then I come back here. And then these are kind of just whimsical. He's playing in someone else's driveway. I have not met these people. I really hope they don't mind. So we're gonna kind of just play with this, and then he comes here and he zooms in and he stops. Okay, and then when we come back, we're gonna do that kind of dotted, like kicking and screaming, and I'm gonna like put it kind of all over the place because I'm trying to deal with a scooter and a toddler, and then maybe I put him down and he rides for a little bit, and then again I'm carrying him, and then he rides for a little bit, and then he stops because we're gonna look both ways for that zoomy car coming, and then we come, and then we kind of, I carry him for a little bit, and he comes around here. And I'm intentionally sort of like making my line imperfect because again, this is a toddler. He's wandering all over the place. I want the line to reflect that. This is not, and then maybe it's here, and then he comes back in, turns the corner, and then we stop. So I'm going to take a look at that line. Is there anything that I want to do to alter it? So I might try to make it thicker in a few places to really draw emphasis to it. So I'm going to kind of build in. I'm going to make my dots a little more pretty. These marks. I'm not really happy with how this turned out, but I feel like if I keep going further, it's just gonna get worse. So we'll see what happens. I might end up moving that scooter over, redrawing it again. And we're gonna kind of emphasize this little wiggle, and this dot. One of the things I want to be really careful of, that I don't drag my arm through this wet black ink, because I will smear it on my paper. And there's some like rough edges to my line, but I actually like that. It gives it, again, we're talking about line quality and how varying up the line quality can actually add some interest. So I'm going to kind of really push that line quality. Also by making this line thicker and darker, again, I'm drawing attention to it. I'm going to kind of play with some of these blobs and make them a little more irregular. All right, I like the feel of that. It's got a good sense of motion, of movement, can tell where I'm going and coming back. It feels like it speeds up and it slows down in places. It feels like it's got a good rhythm. So I'm gonna clean out this brush, and I'm gonna actually put this bigger brush away. I'm gonna be done with it for now, because I want that to be my thickest line. Again, I want it to have the most attention. And I'm gonna grab my pencil at this point and just redraw a couple of these things. So I'm gonna make my stop sign smaller. Now I want to be careful if I'm erasing. If this ink isn't fully dry and I erase across it, I'm going to smear it. So really the best option is at this point is to wait until I'm like done with all my inking and let it really dry, like past when I even think it's ridiculous, and then erase the lines. Okay, and then I'm going to move this back a little bit, and then just add another line of dots. That one looks like it fits. I think with this I'll just make the helmet smaller. Or I can try, I might have the helmet, yeah, there we go. I'll just put the helmet over there, boom, and make those straps really long. And then we'll get rid of that way. So one of the things you want to think about is it's almost like space with people. Like when things get too close together, they just feel crowded and uncomfortable. But when you give things space, it kind of just gives them a lot more attention. All right, so now what I'm gonna do, so I'm gonna take, I think actually I'm gonna skip the medium brush, and I'm gonna do all of these lines with the small brush and make them all small to start with, and then see how that looks. And then if I decide that I wanna go back in with the medium brush, I will do that. But to be honest, now that I'm thinking about them, I want them all to feel like they are light lines, because they're more detailed than the walk. I need them to be light lines to feel like they're less, kind of, they draw less attention. And because there's a lot going on, I'm right-handed, so I'm gonna start up here so I'm not like dragging my hand through ink as I go. So I'm wetting the brush and then loading it up. And with this brush, it's really long but really thin, so I need to be careful I don't push down too much. Otherwise, I can actually make it quite thick. I can get some really, this is called a liner brush. It's good for lines. So I'm gonna start up here in the sand pit. Okay, so it's always good at this point to check to make sure that you've actually inked all the lines that you want to ink. So I think I've done that. And then my next step is to think, okay, do I want to make any of these extra lines thicker? And I don't think I want to. I like that they're thin. They've got some variation to them. And I think I like how the emphasis really is on this walking line. It's thicker, I can tell what's going on, and it's really the motion of the walking line that shows how I want this to be. Okay, so I want to make sure I wait until the ink dries completely to erase it off. Another thing you may have noticed, when you're inking with a brush, you always have to do a pulling motion. When you're doing any sort of painting with a brush, it's all about the pulling motion with the brush. If you try to push like you would do with a pencil or a pen, it kind of like, it spreads out and it staggers and you get a weird line. Now, sometimes, like for example, in my bushes over here, that weird line is really nice. And then sometimes over here when I was trying to do that wheel and I wanted it to feel like a circle, I got a little bit of the bottom because I was being a little bit impatient, and that is not the feeling I want for the circle. So I should have lifted up sooner and continued on the other way so that I could keep pulling. So with a brush, it's all about the pulling motion. Another thing to keep in mind, I sort of like the style where lines end a little bit before instead of overlapping each other. It's not necessarily bad to have lines overlapping or ending perfectly, but more often than not, lines either end a little bit before or a little bit, or they overlap a little bit. And what's gonna look best is if you're consistent. So if you're consistently overlapping your lines, great. Or if you're consistently ending your lines early, great. When you kind of have a mixture, then it feels unintentional, and it feels less stylistic. I probably should have said this earlier, but a note about my demos: your pictures should not necessarily look like mine. I'm demonstrating how to approach the project and some of the things you might want to start thinking about in your project. But you do not need to necessarily model everything you do exactly after how I do it. So if you can think like, I've sort of got a mixture of perspectives here, like the hands are top down, but the house, the scooter, and the car are side to side. The dogs are sort of like we're looking down on them. So I played around with perspective. If you want a more consistent perspective, you can do that. My walk is definitely from a top-down view, but yours doesn't have to be. So you can really play around with all the different possibilities. This is a very kind of simple approach to this project. I've had students make very complex approaches, like you can add a lot more going on and make this a lot more interesting with a little bit more time devoted to it. So go forth, make your walking maps. Just remember, it's all about the movement and the motion of that line, and have fun with it.